We hope you enjoy this podcast. All our conversations are inspired by films we have selected to appear on SDG Vision. So go and take a look and be inspired by people and organizations who are making valuable contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals and making our world a better place for everybody to live. Now, sit back, enjoy, be inspired, and afterwards, go and take action. Well, welcome to the SDG Vision podcast, and today we're really delighted to be welcoming Volli Carucci, who is Head of Resilience and Climate Action for the Sahel region with the United Nations World Food Program. Hello, Volli.
Hello, Pierre. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. We've put this together pretty quickly, and you've been very good. I know you're incredibly busy, so we thank you very much for fitting us in at such short notice. Now, you're Head of Resilience for the sort of Sahel region. Can you explain what the Sahel region is and what your office covers, what regions your office covers?
Just to be precise, I'm the head of the Resilience and Climate Action Unit for the entire regional bureau of the World Food Program in West Africa. And but we specifically focus, at least in relation to our larger program, the Sahel Integrated Resilience Program, into 5 countries, and more are joining. 5 countries, namely Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Mauritania. Now, more focus also into Senegal, into Benin, Togo, now northern East Nigeria, Cameroon. So these countries have typically also Sahelian belts, on their north, and they are facing similar problems. So we're trying to also, use the big experience that now emerges from the Sahel countries to inspire and to adapt to the local context of the southern coastal countries.
Terrific. Well, that's a big responsibility. And most people will have heard of the United Nations. I think most people would have probably heard of the World Food Program. Can you just give us just a brief overview of the World Food Program, how it came into existence and what it does?
Wow. So it came to existence, if my memory doesn't betray me, it was founded in 1961. So it has my age. So it's still very young because we have more dreams than memories. So it's, as an Italian author, inspired me thinking always about. It was first operation started in Sudan, from the Aswan Dam displacement people and so on. So then it moved into operation after operation, the first drought in the Sahel, 1973, the 83, 84, 85, big droughts across sub-Saharan Africa and Ethiopia, tremendous famine and crisis. And then, throughout the world, in support to also not only emergencies, but also major rehabilitation programs. We contributed to the rehabilitation of the Loess Plateau in China, for example, together with IFAD, and the World Bank later on was a humongous program supported and managed by the Chinese government, but it has been a tremendous impact. It's one of the few countries where they erected, I think the only country where they erected a monument to WFP, by the way. I learned from an old timer a while ago. So, the contribution to restoration has been an integral part of our work. We were very close to FAO before. We kind of marked a more independent, more autonomous focus on emergency response, considering the surge of emergencies since the early 90s, the Rwanda being the case, and then followed by many other crises, to have a much stronger footprint on emergency response, quickly, better, and faster. Quickly, and then also to retain a space in restoration, particularly in areas that needed to have that transition. And Ethiopia was a remarkable process. I spent just a little time there, around 16 years in Ethiopia, where we did exactly what you saw in our, Sahel Resilience Program. It was a land rehabilitation at scale through and with the government of Ethiopia throughout the country. It was a magnificent experience that was fully embedded within their approach to scaling further up. So WFP has been very, if you want, in many ways low key in contributing to programs that relate to transitions as well as responding to emergencies every time it was needed. So that's a dual thing. So we have a dual mandate. It's sometimes not well known because we are very visible in emergencies context. We are perhaps less visible also because it's a culture of the organization. We are often very much driven by partnership with and through local institutions, or we jointly work with partners, as we have a huge network of NGOs and network of partnerships with other UN agencies. So it's a bit of that history. Now obviously, we are on the front lines of every crisis you could think of, but we retain also very strong footprint in the type of activities that demand that we tackle hunger at the source, and the source is where there are people, where there is landscape that are degraded, and often, if not all the time, with 90% or more correlation. There is quite a striking, overlapping between desertification, recurrence of climate crisis, and conflicts and social tensions. So it's like a lining of difficult things happening on top of people, generating all what we see now. So, but it's possible to go back to retrieve or to reverse those trends and to retrieve livelihoods, to transform them eventually. So WFP does a lot of that, and we are not alone in this effort. Again, I reiterate, underline that it's a partnership, first of all, with people and communities, and then also, obviously, with institutions that have the legitimate responsibility to carry this forward and move on. But yeah, it's in a nutshell what we do, and obviously not only restoration but nutrition. Yeah, it's a big one.
It's interesting you said that your World Food Programme is probably better known for its food programs rather than resilience work. So one of the reasons we were really interested to speak with you is because we put one of your for the United Nations World Food Programme films on SDG Vision, and it's called The United Nations World Food Programme in Greening the Sahel and Creating Healthy Ecosystems for Healthy Diets. And we were really, really impressed by the scale and the quality of the work, to be honest with you. We will show the film at the end of this podcast, so people can see the film and see what you're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about today. But can you perhaps give us an overview of when the project started and why it began?
When it started, the early days of the program actually started around 2013, 2014, following the big drought of 2012 in Niger. So I'm talking about the Sahel. Then it was the government itself, thinking through what they call a convergence approach. They were actually describing quite strong terms that it was really it was an urgent need to actually equalize partners and focus and concentrate efforts and avoid what they call it the scattered, the silo, the small scale, and short-term type of approaches, no? So we actually renamed those concerns as the 4S: scatter, short-term, silo, and short-term, and small scale. And they want to do the opposite. They want to start really concentrate efforts, converge, bring things together, and strengthen capacities and coordinate better different actors. So we decided to start from the basics. Let's, at least from WFP side, bring different instruments that we had, a few of our ingredients in our quiver, which is starting from the foundation, which is, land. At the end of the day, soils are our biggest, largest donor. And we forget that tiny thing of 50 centimeters at best that took like 80,000 years to form can disappear within less than a decade or be completely inert because of poor management. And because we have a status of land degradation and desertification that is quite high, we decided that the foundation had to be built. We need to restore, to replenish, to retrieve, the productive functions of ecosystems and soils in particular. Then we had the school meals program. Say, okay, let's try to link the school meals with also those restored areas to have a more homegrown approach. And then obviously when you diversify and then we have significant coverage, you have multiplier effects. A land restoration is not only for land, it's for water. So you replenish the water table. So instead of everybody putting the same straw in the same glass of water, how to recharge and replenish those functions. So it allows vegetable gardening, diversity. That is a huge entry point for better nutrition. So nutrition is the third component. Then we thought, okay, little value chain, transformation, drying, packaging, and so on. Further production for value chains development, what we call the smallholder farmers, agriculture, promotion of agriculture entrepreneurship. And then we had the capacity strengthening, because land degradation and desertification doesn't desertify only landscapes and livelihoods, it desertifies skills. So it how to bring back, skills to tackle actually huge complexities there. So that was, let's say, our 6 elements, let's say, that we put together. Said, let's be true to that intent, and then trying to attract other partners, into the same areas. So we had we had a great support from different donors, and we managed now to have very significant partnerships, for example, with UNICEF, GIZ, but many NGOs, like 90 NGOs, local NGOs as well, to implement this program. But the primary partner is government and local institutions at decentralized level. And that was another focus. How to help those foresters, in particular, les eaux et forêts, agronomists deployed there, but often unable to contribute to actually exercise their profession. So that was another one. And then finally, we thought that to replenish the skills set was actually to bring academia into it, how to support local academia into research from those integrated resilience sites. But for your information, now we have 251 Master 2 level degree students that graduated from those different countries, 6 PhDs ongoing, curricula development on good practices, local innovation from local people for local solutions. So it's a different paradigm shift. So that was, let's say, the original intent that obviously matured and evolved and got itself increasingly robust. We had also, we brought in a very strong evidence generation component. That WFP has been not the best example of documenting what worked. We do a lot. We are operationally driven. So, okay, let's also learn and bring evidence about what we do. And that expanded in 2018, actually, in 2016, 17 into Burkina Faso, and then now, since 2018, to the 5 countries. And is expanding further. So we are quite pleased to see the level of interest that it has generated at the grassroots level, not because we had to convince those local institutions, they were convinced, but is to bring more attention to this huge challenge that is something that we need to tackle all together. And I was at the COP in Riyadh in last month in December. It was fascinating to see how much excitement there is about land. Finally, we got the land back. We don't look only at the sky, the climate change agenda, which is humongous, but we look at the land, and those are the two sides of the moon, right? So we need to look at both sides simultaneously. We cannot just ignore those. So I'm deviating a little bit, but just to explain the genesis of why also WFP there is because those were areas where we had every single year food insecurity, shocks after shocks. So we had to stop the way that we used to do also our regular emergency support, that we had to change. We had to move into actually the resilience agenda.
That's really interesting. You talk about the land. Could you give us an idea, perhaps? I know it would probably change from country to country, but typically, if I was to go there before the project, what would the land have looked like and what would it look like now? And what activities would be happening now that were not happening before the resilience program?
It's a very good question. So how to describe it? We describe it about a typical community of, usually Sahelian communities are made of 4 or 5 villages in a cluster, ranges from 500 to 1,500 households, with a central village and a few satellite ones and scattered settlements. Typically, the landscape is made of a zone of flat foot plains, and the French terminology comes much better, floodplains. And then we had gentle sloping lands, very crusted, very affected by pavement crust and the splashing effect of rainfall. Therefore, very poorly receptive to precipitation and generating a lot of runoff. And then we have hilly areas, and then finally the plateaus. These are a little bit of a typical topo sequence, right? And the plateaus are largely barren lands with used for grazing, with little vegetation. You see more and more vegetation towards the drainage lines, so the bas-fonds, the floodplains, where usually during the few good rains we have an expansion of the water sideways, inundation, and then back into the riverbed. So those places are more populated with acacias like Acacia fiderbias and others that have been actually promoted as a great agroforestry system in many parts of the Sahel, particularly in Niger, but not only Niger, by different programs, But it was an ancient tradition. So that was a typical landscape. Let's not forget that population pressure, livestock management, border restriction of movements have also increased pressure in some of those habitats for years. So it was it was very clear to see the deterioration of many food systems and many of those landscapes that gradually reduced the diversity that they had even before, when we had, say, more sorghums and millets, but also with cowpeas and agroforestry, into gradually more millet, and then almost no pulses and very little other alternatives, drying water tables, and so on. With typically a lot of outmigration and distress outmigration, because we need to be careful about how to qualify migration, which is a physiological mega safety net within West Africa region, but it was distressed. It was early departure, late return, sometimes jumping 1 or 2 years, a huge hardship on women and children. So that's also was a typical characterization of the communities. Fetching water was between 2 and 4 and 5 hours, as I've seen out of Niger and Chad, for around 200 days a year. So that was just, people don't see hardships equal non-degradation. It's huge. Early dropouts of school, because if men arrive late to help the families to prepare the fields for the short rainy season, then the children are dropped out of school. As soon as they reach 7, 8 years of age, they are able to manage a little hope. They are there to help the elders and the mothers to actually prepare the field. So they don't complete school years. So the repercussions, the almost like an infernal cycle, right? And you see also other negative coping, like early marriages, because typically an harvest period is a period of marriages. So when the harvests fail, options of last resort, it's not because they want to do it, it's because it's utter sheer poverty that drives some of these phenomena. So how to break that cycle. Okay, how to rebuild the foundation. Then you can build. Sometimes we forget our foundations, but when you build a house, but the house on food security, the house of bringing things back into a normalcy, not really full-blown development, because this is not even our role, but at least putting some solid foundation to reverse those trends and to reduce humanitarian needs that also create other type of dependencies if continuing over a very long period of time. Governments and people are not defeated, for God's sake. They want to move on. They want a different way to go about things. They want more money in their pocket. They want to send children to school. They want to access an health center, and they want to have more security in their granaries, as a typical farmer, or more livestock and horns around just to be on the safe side. So there are a number of things that we need to think about. And then we thought also about a very simple approach, because we want to institutionalize this approach. And now we are really going that direction, which is starting from a very basic consideration. People need dialogues here. So there is an appreciation for dialogue, for community participation, to talk, engagement, talk and watch and walk, and so time with communities. So we have this committee called community-based participatory planning approach. Very simple. Is just you need a little cohort of local staff with the community, spend a real week or 2 weeks together and begin to think how to move forward. So that was part of the approach. And then he identified 1, 2, 3, 4 key, things to do together, and try to implement them at the best, in the best possible manner. And that is the whole also professionalization of some of these approaches and some of these techniques that are also not, as you may see some of them in those videos, the half moon is a typical one of them. Well, we have 10, 15 variation of that just for different soils, different crops, different slopes, different things. And that's one of the 50 activities, which is only a third of the 130 activities that we have now in the National Compendium for agriculture, restoration, and agroforestry, etc., within the government of Niger.
Can I just stop you there? Because people who haven't seen the film will probably wonder what you mean by the crescent. And it is visually very arresting. You're talking about what people would say sort of desert-like country, and then these fertile half-crescent or crescent-shaped patches of fertile ground that people are working, producing agricultural products from. And that is presumably, obviously, in terms of food security, that's absolutely critical to stop people from migrating, I guess.
Yes, it is the first objective, at least at WFP, is to have people to be able to feed themselves, to get into self-reliance and to improve their nutrition. And there is no healthy diet without healthy soils. That's for sure. So we have to move there. Then obviously there are co-benefits. Soils are the largest, together with oceans, reservoir of carbon sink. So it's we did a study in Niger, for instance, on that. It's simply huge, but it's a co-benefit. Okay, so we need also to work that agenda on adaptation, and it has a social cohesion co-benefits, jobs on a seasonal basis, but also jobs that will be generated out of the rehabilitated areas. For example, value chains for further production.
So could you give me an idea in terms of value chains for fodder production? Could you just give us an idea as to what that looks like typically? Or
for example, we have through this crescent half moons. If you barren land, rain falls here, gets into my eyebrows, simulating half moons, and being trapped there between the half moons, there is a space. My mustache is the next row. So intercepting everything that falls in between rows so that we multiply the amount of water that falls into a given spot. So I simplify here. It's a micro water catchment. The half moon is a micro water harvesting technique, like the trenches, like the herringbones like negarims and few others. It's a huge range there. So it's that intent to trap rainfall, allow it to infiltrate, generate more production. So if you are a grass seed in Maradi, the middle of Niger, inside the half moon, all of a sudden you are like, oh my God, you are like in Northern Ivory Coast, because now you receive like twice the amount of rainfall that you receive. So it's really, and the same is for sorghum. And crops that were not even there before are enabled by those structures, or different type of soil management and land management activities. Compost making is another one. We feed those structures with additional complements, organic complements, because there is a huge abundance of manure and raw materials at specific seasons. Now we have compost entrepreneurship. I think we have more than 60,000 tons of compost that have been produced by women and used around those places. I mean, in places that you never even bet that's possible. It's possible at scale. It's amazing. So it's all a huge effort to trap, store, and re-enable production, whether it is grasses, whether it is crops. Now, on grasses, on pasture, for example, we realize that there are now sites that are 500, 1,000 and more hectares, right? This is 1.5, 2, 3 tons of hay per hectare. At the good season, one single bundle of 15 kg of hay is worth around $2. Okay? So just multiply this by 100 hectares just for a value chain is a lot of money and a lot of jobs, not only for animal feeding and trading, because there is also a lot of relationships that have been now generated from those areas to allow temporary grazing, to trade with transhumants that pass by, for example. So they have what they call seasonal, parking, and then feeding the animals, where before they had to pay for the parking of the animals and manure even more. So win-win relationships that have been enabled in a number of instances. And it's one part of the many things that we see evolving.
Incredible. I mean, the scale is just extraordinary.
For us, it's still, we have an ambition, a vision of tripling, making 10 times bigger. This is possible. I mean, we see that there is an appetite in many of these countries for that. Governments like in Chad are incredibly committed. The same in Niger and in Mauritania nowadays too. I mean, it's fascinating to see how this is so important for that.
And the terrific thing about a resilience program is that the World Food Program and your partners, once it's established and the system is established and people have learnt and they've got the resources, you can move on to other regions and others. So that's what development is all about. And it's a powerful story that you tell. And goodness only knows how bad it would have been with the increasing climate change if you hadn't have intervened at the time that you had.
Yeah, that's a very good observation. We had actually one interesting example of that. In 2021, we had this big drought that was the biggest drought in Niger and a few other countries in the region since 2012. So it was almost like a 10 years big hit. In 2022, we had, because we undertake the surveys and everything on the assessments, we realized that actually in the old sites where we had phased out, 81% of those sites didn't need any relief assistance in 2022, 2023, 2 consecutive years, right? So, and these were, hit by the largest drought after 2012. And I think we had just little capacity strengthening and things like that. But, the heavy lifting of food assistance or anything related to food aid was over, okay? So that's a very interesting thing. So it also triggered a lot of discussion internally on how to even measure more and better some of these results. I just came back a few months ago from a tour in Chad, where I was accompanied by Andrew Millicent, the filmmaker that also did another video. I don't know if you saw it, but it was very interesting in Chad to see one single site, the Tandu Valley. I think, it takes me quite a lot to be impressed now by it. And, but that was amazing. My jaw dropped. It was one side with 64 hectares of vegetable gardens, 800 hectares cashment, 3 dams. And in the last 4 years, I think they generate already over $1.2 million of revenues. This is what we're to speak about resilience. And the Abéché town, there is a feeder road now because it's all organic. There were 2,000 compost heaps there, like a battalion there. It's all organic. And the Abéché town, 50 kilometers away, sending these tuk-tuk, things to buy the vegetables there because they have a better taste. So it even was things that we didn't expect. This is really, the next level of ambition.
And these are stories that need to be heard. We're surrounded by, obviously, quite rightly, bad news around climate change and disasters that are happening across the world. But we do need to listen to stories like this, stories of hope, and learn from the World Food Programme as to how to engage with partners and with local people. And, often often at the beginning, it's not the easiest process because you have to sit with local people, you have to talk with local people, you have to find out yourselves from local people what their issues are. So it's quite a long, drawn-out process, but my goodness, the results in the end are staggering.
Now, it is also a way to provide a different perspective. It's a different narrative. It's not a narrative of cracking soils and dead carcass of cows and, swollen bellies and stuff like that. It's actually a different narrative. And this narrative, there is such an appetite for such narrative in these countries as well. Okay. They don't like to be portrayed the same way that sometimes our Western media do. They have a huge dignity. They are not defeated. This is a way to recognize their strengths and to build upon those. It doesn't mean not to make mistakes. There are plenty of mistakes, technical errors, and things that don't work, things that work better. So that's not a problem. We learn and we move forward, right? Of course. But it's really providing that sense of this is our work, is our contribution to even not only us, to the world. Because when I have now 300,000 hectares invested in the Sahel, achieved in the Sahel, okay, of land rehab, which is equivalent between 800 to 900,000 of watershed treatment overall, right? Because it's actual treatment versus, the more ecosystems benefits, multiplied effects. We're talking about a huge ecosystem service provided to the world as well. Well, and what kind of the story of the poorest people on earth making perhaps the largest contribution to the climate change agenda and to the ecosystem and biodiversity agenda too, because we see, for example, in the treated side, we have like tens of species of grasses, dormant seeds, etc., awakening, trees going up, indigenous varieties being nurtured. We have more, greater food baskets, not monoculture. So this is a huge benefit, right? We need to recognize more and more of these efforts, and not simply speak about one plant or one magic silver bullet or one drilling boreholes everywhere.
Sure. It's really interesting. And I think, the word integrated is really important here because we're talking about, it's not just one approach, as you're saying, it's using different approaches. And, obviously the United Nations also set up the Sustainable Development Goals, which we're keen on promoting. And, just listening to you in terms of what you're describing that process of change. Talking about just looking at health, it's not just physical health, it's mental health as well, there's nothing more crippling than despair, or lack of pride, however wrong that may be felt, but it's felt by people if they don't have a future. And, you talk about education, SDG 4, talking about climate action, SDG 13. Life on land, 15. Gender equality. We haven't talked about, women in detail yet, but it would be very interesting to hear about, obviously SDG 5 is gender equality. And it would be really interesting to hear from you how women's role within the project.
Big role. Actually, in many of these sites, the women are the ones that are actually making the transformation. They are the one leading the way. They are the custodians also of a lot of local knowledge regarding tree species, indicators of drought. They are, the real, they shoulder so much, okay? One of the biggest problems that we still struggle with, and I think collectively, all actors around, is sorry, there's a background noise, is the land tenure issue, okay? So some countries have very well structured policies. They have developed what they call tenure commissions at different levels, decentralized level like Niger. So is a bit easier. So for instance, on land rehabilitation in Niger, we had 5 years extendable to 10 or more years of land use certification on the rehabilitated lands, and 10 years and doubling that also for the vegetable gardening areas that are very juicy they attract a lot of attention, right? Because they produced a lot. So those agreements that are signed with every single beneficiary have a huge impact on sustainability, on providing the breathing space that they need for moving forward. And for people that have a tunnelized vision of literally tomorrow from hand to mouth, having 5 years, 10 years is already a mega leap. Then that will give additional time to work on more longer term, agreements. In other instances, like in Chad, is a combination, is state and customary law. Very important there. Customary law is always important across the Sahel. We should not bypass the tradition, the cultures is not something that needs to be done. But how to blend with state and local, cultures and transmission, and bringing this as a social cohesion element. So there's a lot of work there that we're doing together with local authorities, with customary laws, traditional leaders. That's super important in a number of these contexts. And yeah, it's a patient work. And we have partners like GIZ, for instance, who is helping us on the tenureship aspect itself. So it's not one agency that does everything, but we are really focusing on that aspect a lot. And that, for women and for youth, is a critical part.
I was going to ask, in terms of cultural, obviously cultural values, etc. What has there been any resistance to the increased role of women in food production? Not that with at all. On the contrary, this also, sometimes I feel like some of these concerns are derived from perceptions as opposed to, is also because the dialogue has to be inclusive. It cannot just be that now we are going to come here, we're going to discuss only with the most vulnerable. No, it's a joint exercise, because if I don't respect, we don't pay the right attention to the internal dynamics between what they call better off, or the les maîtres de terre, the ones that the custodians of the land, we are not going to address the problems of the poorest, because the negotiation of actually getting access to land that has been landed, or it's been, engaged, what do you call in exchange of money, given, is retrieved back because of the investment that we are doing, and because of the, understanding that those dynamics are healthier for both sides, right? So it's a negotiation that needs to take place, respecting the local dynamics, but at the same time bringing nudges and elements of, making sure that a lot of the benefits actually go in the right direction. Women groups, youth groups. I was going to say, why is that important, do you think? Why is the role of women, or the active role of women, important?
They are staying in the first place. A very simple thing, they're staying longer and more often linked to the land. They are responsible for nutrition, and they have an incredible ability to manage natural resources. They are natural foresters more than men. And some of the problems on early marriages, for instance, that it cuts the transmission of knowledge on how to use local products, local leaves, local foods for nutrition. So we have, for instance, incredibly, families that have no land, no livestock, very little, but are not malnourished. But they have a much, compared to others. And when you look at this, you see also age differences. You see that one time 1 year of education is a huge difference between those who don't have even a single year of education.
Yeah. Yeah. And young people as well. I mean, you've talked about young people going to universities and being able to use those skills to improve their communities and the regions in which they live. Are there other ways in which young people have been engaged in the project?
It is different from place to place. Like, for instance, sometimes it's women and, a few men start working and start investing. And then we see the year later that they call the youth back. We have jobs. We need your help for the value chains. We need transport. We need all sorts of things. So the anxiety, we saw women, we had women say, now we have got at least my 2 sons back. Okay. They're not forced to migrate anymore. For example, for instance, people that were from Chad crossing the Boko Haram area every season and getting their way back to help their families. Again, very dangerous journeys. There was one lady that broke her heart. There were 3 years she was without any news about her husband. So, and the husband went as far as working into Libya. So there are those dynamics are day-to-day realities in those areas. And then having jobs, having something to, make their land back to production again and use that production to trade and to do things and get income money instead of scavenge for a few dollars somewhere in very dangerous places and facing journeys that sometimes put the whole family on, sometimes a village at risk because they have to pay ransoms and when things don't work out, or even worse when their children disappear. So these are many of those stories that we heard in Maradi, Zender, Maradi, Niger in general, but also in Chad, and recently even more striking because we're talking about the interface between the Sudanese refugees, and the host communities, and the amazing generosity of the Chadian government who has allocated land to be restored so that the refugees could have a place to stay. I mean, I've never seen it. And they've enacted the policy, okay? And Chadians are very strong people, very tough people, but incredibly generous. So they realize this is a situation that we need to deal with in a different manner. I mean, I was really impressed. Now we are super busy with even supported by the government to implement some of these programs. It's not anymore a done.
It's fascinating, really. I mean, in Western Europe, migration is a very big, hot topic that some elements of the political process are using to benefit themselves. And it's few people are really, or many people are aware of the scale of migration in sub-Saharan Africa, and Sahel and Sahara as well. The Chad government, as you say, not only looking after refugees, but actually providing them with land, which is extraordinary generosity, as you say. And it really bucks a lot. It changes a lot of the narratives, the dominant narratives that we hear in Western Europe. And that's why we thought this was such an important film to show on the channel, because this story needs to be heard. And also, I think, that people will think of the World Food Programme and they think of, they're just handing out food to people, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that's really important in certain circumstances when there is no alternative. But I think everything you've said is so important for a wider audience to hear. If not only to understand what the United Nations really does do, as you say, you do incredible amount of work on the ground, but perhaps don't have the time or resources to actually communicate that work to a wider audience. And hopefully we can help you do that. And that's what we're here for. One thing that I was going to ask about was about, on that sort of issue of migration, land and resource related conflict. Has that reduced at all, or have you been able to research the effect or the impact of the resilience project on conflict?
Conflict is a big word, and it depends what we mean by that. We had a study undertaken by IFPRI and the Institute for Peace and Development of Ghana on Niger and Burkina Faso. We are going to expand now, and there was also a study done by CIPRI in Mali, and actually highlighted. Those studies highlighted really an incredible amount of benefits in terms of strengthening social cohesion between these different groups that were very much, very tense at each other. So there are tangible results on how this program has benefited relationship intra and inter-community. Also not only between, let's say, adjacent communities, between communities, but also with different livelihood groups.
Within communities?
No, outside communities. For example, I'll give you an example. Last July in Niger, we had passing by Maradi, and then it was this very interesting story about the governor has written to the World Food Program, was very graceful a demand which was not even necessary, to explain that actually there were transhumans running for their life from the northern Nigeria border, entering into Niger with their livestock. They were pastoralists, with 1,000 head of cattle. And that was not the season for animals to actually come in because all the crops are still standing, and that would have created a mega clash. But guess what? We had a few, 10,000 or more 1,000 hectares of, pasture land with grasses there. So they negotiated with the community for the transhumans to graze there temporarily for 4 weeks. The alternative would have been that those would have invaded the crop fields and generated mega clashes. And that we know where it ends. And that was an amazing story of woe, no? Because they managed then, they trade cows in exchange of these some compensations and so on. But that was an incredible story of, then I told the guys, have you documented that? No. So this is some of the things that, we should do better. But it explains that once you reach a certain scale, this can even, that was an exceptional moment, but that could have really triggered big trouble in some of these areas.
Again, it's incredible compromise, isn't it? Compromises are reached, and which, again, we don't hear about often in Western Europe or America. We don't hear about these things, which is why, as you say, documentation is so important. But of course, there's a resource issue related to documentation, I suppose, as well.
There is a relationship between the quality of the program, the scale of the program, the duration, and also the reduction of bad coping, like distress out migration. Again, I repeat, migration is one of the biggest safety nets within West Africa. 90% and counting of the movements are actually within West Africa. So there are relationships between, so the Sahel is like a transmission belt of labor that goes into the coastal countries, that returns. They have their affiliation, they have their cousins, parents, people established for a very long period of time, but also, almost like hubs The people from Tawa going to specific places in Côte d'Ivoire. Another region from Chad goes into specific areas of, even up to South Sudan. So it's really a lot of networks and movements. However, when it gets really bad, when there are conflicts, armed conflicts, and so on, when they're stuck, or where there is sheer poverty and they have no other choice than either to try to move or to do other, or to get into other type of trouble, illegal activities, and joining some trouble. So it's getting complicated. But these are many people wants to move on with their lives. They have ideas. They are very young. They're energetic. So it's a pleasure to even to see some of the local. There is a French word, débrouillardage, how they manage to deal with things at the local level and be very creative. So how we can enable more of those things, right? There is a huge dynamic, continent, and the more water migrate, the more soil migrate, the more people will migrate. I mean, we need to stop the problem at the source, right? So that's why land restoration, that thing that we walk literally 6,000 times or 10,000 times a day when we are not lazy on the solution to many of our problems, and we don't even look at them. So how we can retrieve that relevance and bring it, up to the agenda, because if they're gone, even climate change will shoot at a dead corpse. So we need to start looking better and stronger down in the eyes to people and on the land, on what is inside the land, what is above the land, and there are human beings, intelligent people that love the trees and grasses and all sorts of creatures. I mean, let's invest in that.
Yeah, it's investing in human creativity, as you said. That is not in short supply in the areas that the World Food Programme is working.
Is huge. I mean, it's amazing to see in how many of these places, just by working out one single activity, we got 3 designs of the half moons are actually not us, or I put my technical hat on some of my good friends. It's from local people.
Yeah.
It's solutions that emerge because people have incredible capacity to see things differently. We have adapted the technology of Yakuba Sawadogo, the creator of the inventor of the Zai pit. The Zai pit is integrated within our half moons. The Zai pit is, Yakuba Sawadogo was an old man. He passed away 2 years ago. He's a Burkina Faso land hero. He started 50 years ago observing the work of termites. They were,
termites.
Termites. They were soaking in branches and residues and so on. And everything that was working where the termite had taken things down was growing better than when the termites were not there, when there was no residue. So he thought that kind of little depression, it's created these pits where in November, it dug the pits, 30 centimeters wide, 40 centimeters wide, 50 centimeters deep, in batteries, along more or less approximate contours. So 16,000, 20,000 pits per hectare. Okay? So pellets shooting with a shotgun on a landscape. Then waiting a little bit. Okay, waiting a little bit so that the wind and so on brings leaves and everything else, then looking at the work of termites. Couple of months before, 3 months before the rainy season, manure inside the pits. Then that big activator, everything, and it created a mini chamber, infiltration chamber under each pit. So imagine little cocoons of better infiltration under each pit.
So the termites would drag down leaves?
Would drag down everything and work out, and termites with exudates of their saliva and everything.
Fertility of the soil.
Exactly. So it creates an infiltration chamber. And that, created then sorghum fields, millet fields, where before there was just dead, crusted pavement land. It was just what they call the terre morte, the dead lands. And then obviously he was thrilled by this, and it began to expand. And then people that were laughing at it at the very beginning, there were stories about that. They began to imitate him. And then this was captured by different scientists, universities, and then it became popularized. Even when I was in Ethiopia, it's the first time I heard those things, we started immediately trying some of those, right? And this is a technique that is used in millions of hectares across sub-Saharan Africa.
Fantastic. And it's local knowledge.
It's a local knowledge. And it became bigger for tree planting. He had himself created a wood forest, a fruit forest of 28 hectares around his place, which is now a sanctuary protected so it was awarded with a Land for Life award by Mississippi in 2019. And some of those guys are there everywhere. In every community, like when we were at school, Pierre, we had always someone genius in painting, isn't it? Drawing. Or in mathematics, not me. But, we had someone really gifted. In every community, we have gifted people with soil, gifted people with stones, gifted people with plants, gifted people with many other things. And farmers are typically jealous individuals. I'm a farmer back home in Italy, so I'm always looking. My neighbor said, I'm really not happy when I see my crops not up to the standard, and try to, then ask, sideways. And how did you do that? That's just a
natural human.
It's a natural thing. So how we can capture those? That's why we work also with universities to capture that.
Volli, we could talk I could talk all day. I know you've got more important things to be engaged with.
No worries, it's a pleasure.
But honestly, it's really important to be capturing these incredible stories and the richness of work that's happening in the Sahel. Just very lastly, we work with the Sustainable Development Goals. We feel that more people should hear about the Sustainable Development Goals and take action in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals. Does it influence your work at all with the World Food Programme? Is it there as a reference point, or how do you relate to it?
We relate to number 2, SDG 2. That's
which is zero hunger.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
exactly. So that's a beacon, right? That's our North Polar Star. So we also have clearly, as you mentioned them before, critically for us are the ones related to water, to women, to land, to climate. So this in a nutshell. So clearly, number 2 is a big focus, and number 17 as well is a service provision, because that's a different one.
Which is partnership for the goals, and you've talked about the partners you've worked with.
Exactly. So, but yeah, it's at the end of the day, if I have to my preference will be that the biggest difference we can make within the time that is allowed to us, in terms of, I'm speaking about World Food Programme, which is 5 years leap at a time in terms of our what we call country strategy, is to really invest on those things that make the biggest difference for people and where they live. Then they have co-benefits, but we need to, the center of gravity needs to be there, in terms of, our focus.
Volli, it's been absolutely fascinating. And not only that, it's been inspirational. And I really hope that we can reach many, many people who will have an enriched understanding of what the World Food Programme does and the variety of its work. We would love you to come back and give us an update on your work, be it in 6 months, a year, whatever. We always want to hear about the projects that you're engaged with. And as you've mentioned, they will change all the time because local knowledge will change them. So it's a never fascinating journey to sustainability. And just want to thank you very much for giving us your time and your expertise.
Anytime. You're most welcome. And we can always exchange on some of the materials that we have. I know Evelyn has probably shared with you a few things. And but yeah, even on the technical conversation basis, I'm always, interested also to hear from Gary's experiences.
Of course, Gary, who is our founder at SDG Vision. Volli, thank you very, very much indeed, and I wish you well with your incredible work. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome to one of the largest scale land restoration projects on the planet. Before this worked, people relied on food aid just to survive. But 10 years ago, a vast barren wasteland began to transform, and now 500,000 people are feeding themselves from this land. So could this work be the key to ending hunger in Africa and beyond? Let's find out. I'm traveling in the Sahel of Africa with the largest humanitarian agency on Earth, the United Nations World Food Program, the first responders to hunger in war zones and disasters. But what I came here to see is the mind-blowing work they're doing to actually solve hunger by fixing the underlying problem. Because when soils blow away and the land desertifies, people can't feed themselves. But what I'm witnessing here is the repair of soils and water across Africa at a scale that I never imagined possible. This is Africa's Great Green Wall, where a massive strip of trees is being planted across the continent to hold back the Sahara Desert. But the thing is, these places I went to are not places that just anyone can visit. Access is tightly controlled. But the WFP works wherever there's hunger in the world. So they invited me along on this mission to tell this critical story that almost no one knows about. And in this 4-part series, I'm explaining the details of some of the most important work of our time. We are here in Niger, Africa, known as Niger. In this nearly 5 square mile block of land restoration, 5 different villages planted about 100,000 trees, put in about 20 tons of grass seed, and we can see the land is starting to come back to life. But will the plants survive? The key is to make sure they get enough water. But that's not easy to do in a desert because this region has what's called the drought flood cycle. We have 9 dry months. The land becomes parched, and when the rains finally do come, the rain can't soak in, and it rushes down and it creates flooding in lowlands. But in the Sahel, we find an age-old water harvesting structure called the half moon. This simple structure has all of this capacity to store this water and hold this water until the water soaks down into the ground. There are a lot of different variations on these half-moon structures, and which one you choose depends on what your end goal is. Are you creating a forest, or a grassland, or a millet growing area? And how well do the soils hold or drain water? But the basic idea is that the half moon's laid out on contour and it's dug so it intercepts the water flowing down slope during heavy rains. There are deep pits dug inside and outside of the half moon called zai pits, which collect organic matter that blows or flows into the pits, and ultimately they allow for the deep soakage of rainwater into the ground. Oftentimes a tree is planted, as well as grasses and other seeds that germinate with the rains. Birds and wind bring in more seeds, and the half moon becomes a concentration point for water, nutrients, plants, and animals. The ecosystem grows and life returns. It's astoundingly simple, but how does it work in practice? This site is just 1 year old, and this site is the same design, but 8 years old. We've got the rows of half moons with the trees planted in them, and now the trees are growing up. They're beginning to form a canopy over the ground. We see the grasses, we see the ground covered, and even now we have water in these half moons.
So here you see this half moon. This is still the water. At this stage, still harvesting a lot of water. We have different local species and a lot of grasses. It's good animal feed. This shade, this temperature, you already have 5 to 8 degrees less compared to the places that are without treatment. this is one of the best ways to improve food security, because at the end of the day, this is a food basket in the making, but also nourish the land that nourishes people.
You must be wondering just how this restoration creates food. You see, when land's restored, it produces the grasses that feed livestock, which means people have milk to drink and meat to eat. The native Sahel trees produce leaves and fruits that can be eaten by the tough camels and goats who browse the thorny branches in times of need during the long dry season. The trees shade, they hold the soil, they soak in water, they nourish livestock. What I'd seen so far looked promising, but it's a pretty young site that hasn't fully developed. I couldn't help but wonder, is a system like this really enough to end hunger? To find out the truth, I needed to visit the very best site they could take me to near the southern border with Nigeria. The border is porous and there are militant groups that sometimes cross over, so we needed a military escort. But visiting this mature site was critical to seeing the full extent of what is possible in this kind of restoration work. What you see behind me was once a barren wasteland with compacted hardpan where the water was rushing quickly off, not soaking in, no organic matter, no plants, no trees, and now we see a dramatic transformation of this landscape. When we look at satellite images from the last 7 years, we can see that the area of bare exposed soil has literally dropped to zero. This land has fully recovered its capacity to hold water and grow biodiversity. And that means the potential for growing food is huge. That is so clear that the government of Niger is all in for this mega restoration. And I got the inside scoop directly from the chief forest ranger of the state of Maradi. He took me on a thorough tour of the site and pointed out all kinds of fascinating details, including some pretty remarkable ripple effects of the restoration work on the greater region.
Donc, et vous voyez, le niveau de régénération contribue vraiment à la concrétisation de la grande muraille verte au Niger.
So what I learned was, since we are at the edge of the Sahara Desert, this area is really affected by strong, hot winds coming from the desert. This can really dry out the landscape. But this site's continuous tree canopy actually breaks the force of those drying winds. The point is to actually block the expansion of the desert. Niger is one of the hottest countries on the planet. The temperatures are significantly lower in these forested areas. And it's not just deep in the interior of the sites where you have all these trees, it's also the edges of the sites we're seeing the same temperature effects. This whole project has become a biodiversity net. All sorts of seeds are blowing in, birds are attracted, they're bringing other seeds. Right now we're here in the 3-month wet season. It looks lush and green. You can see all of this fodder. You can imagine the animals becoming fat. But the critical function of this system is really in the dry season. 9 months of the year, this is dry, when there's just not a lot out there. So this diverse perennial polyculture here provides types of foods that can be harvested in the dry season. There are different yields that grow here even during the dry season. They're harvesting plants for culinary purposes, for medicinal purposes. We think of the Great Green Wall as stopping the expansion of the Sahara Desert, but it's actually so much more than that. The Great Green Wall is actually rebuilding the ecological matrix of a region. And when we start to see the effects at scale, like this large site and the 528 other Great Green Wall sites in Niger, we actually see the restoration of the ecological fabric of this region. Just within this 800-hectare site, there are 3 million cubic meters of water that have soaked into the ground here instead of running off. And 15% of that water is actually soaking into the deep aquifer and regenerating the permanent water table. The actual effects on people's lives is a very tangible thing. We traveled to a new garden in the nearby village to see the real-life effects of a regenerated water table.
Over time, the water table has risen and there's water available, allowing for production pretty much to take place all year round. In this area where we are, this is just a 1.5 hectare market garden site, one of 9. Communities here are now able to produce crops in these gardens because they're pumping water from the ground, water that has been improved from the rising water table due to the restoration activities that have taken place elsewhere. Before this activity, 9 out of every 10 children that were tested were malnourished. What we saw earlier in the market garden, the community is able to produce a variety of diverse nutritious foods, including vegetables and fruits, which are then also used in their local diets, contributing to a better nutrition for the community and lessening malnutrition for their children and for themselves.
Over the last 5 years in Niger, an average of 3 million people per year were food insecure and needed food aid. But in that same time period, these resilience projects have gotten 500,000 people off of long-term food assistance. Let that sink in for a minute. 500,000 people are being fed from the 528 resilience projects in Niger. So this is obviously working on a lot of levels. But the big question is, how do we scale this up to the place where it can actually end regional hunger? In Niger, in the last 10 years, the World Food Program with the government and partners have restored about 300,000 hectares. When you do this type of land treatment, you're actually helping areas downstream because this water is soaking in. Then you also get this incredible wind protection effect. So for every hectare that you restore, you actually affect 3 times that amount of land. So the 300,000 hectares really is more like 900,000 hectares. Now, Niger is a huge country. The Sahel is a massive area. So this is still just a fragment of what needs to happen here, right? We're beginning to see a scale of solution that matches the scale of the problem.
Walking through this, you can imagine that you're walking through the Great Green Wall. The Great Green Wall is the possibility of transforming desert lands, degraded lands into food baskets. Now the vision is how we can collectively put all hands on deck and make this regeneration in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Sahel, in Niger, an unprecedented game changer.
The World Food Program supports these projects in a lot of ways, including equipment, training, food, and money for the people doing the work. This helps to stabilize the community while growing their natural resources.
We can do this together with our partners. The government of Niger, they have taken resilience as their strong vision to transform rural areas in the country. This is very important within the context of Niger in terms of the concept of the land becoming the nourishing mother of the population.
Nous avons voulu, en tout cas, que nos actions rentrent dans le cadre donc, de ces actions de la Grande Muraille Verte.
It's basically saying that as WFP, we need to recognize that we can play a catalyst role, we can play a supporting role, but the biggest role and the biggest achievement is what actually communities are able to do by themselves. We really need to be engaged and motivated within the vision of the Great Green Wall. It means also a Great Green Wall against hunger.
na taimako fam ku ba da abinci ku ba da kudi talakawa su ji daɗi a wurin Allah ku sami lada Allah kiyaye